Saline County, Nebraska, August 1885. The prairie air was thick with the buzz of cicadas and the smell of curing hay. Under a sun that bleached the very blue from the sky, Jaromir Kovacic was doing something that made no sense. He wasn't building a house. His neighbors were sure of that. He was committing an act of architectural madness. He worked not with an axe and adze, but with a sharpened spade and a strange wooden jig. He wasn't felling cottonwoods down by the creek. He was harvesting the prairie itself. With methodical, rhythmic swings, he sliced into the buffalo grass sod, the blade ringing faintly as it severed the dense mat of roots. He wasn't cutting the thin, manageable strips most homesteaders used for their soddies. He was carving out monstrous bricks, each one 4 inches thick, a foot wide, and 2 feet long. Each slab, dark with soil and bristling with living roots, weighed nearly 40 pounds. The real insanity, however, wasn't the size of the bricks, but how he laid them. Caleb Finch, whose own soddy was a model of the accepted craft, leaned on a fence post and watched, his face a mask of disbelief. Silas Croft, a carpenter who thought in clean lines of milled lumber, stood beside him, shaking his head. "He's laying them inside out," Croft muttered, as if confirming a diagnosis. "The grass is facing in. Every sodbuster from here to the Dakota Territory knows you lay the grass down to rot into mortar." Jaromir, oblivious or indifferent, hefted another block onto the rising wall of his impossibly long 60-foot cabin. He placed it carefully, not with mortar, but flush against its neighbors, staggering the joints in a pattern no one recognized. The interior of his house, as it grew, looked like a shaggy, green-furred cave. Bartholomew Fenstermacher, the county auditor, pulled his buggy to a stop on the section road. A man of numbers and regulations, Fenstermacher saw the world in terms of compliance. He adjusted his spectacles and stared at the bizarre structure. It wasn't just wrong. It was a potential violation. "Kovacic," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of official concern. "What is this?" "The Homestead Board has standards for proving up. A structure must be sound." Jaromir paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a dirt-caked hand. He looked at the auditor, his expression calm. "It will be sound," he said, his English thick with the accents of Moravia. Fenstermacher gestured with a leather-gloved hand. "The grass is on the inside. Man, the damp will ruin you. The whole thing will turn to mud and slurry. And when the spring thaw comes," he warmed to his subject, his voice taking on a lecturing tone, "those oversized blocks will subside differentially. Your roof line will warp clear out of tolerance. You'll never prove up. This is foolishness." Jedediah Miller, a farmer on the next quarter section, chimed in from his wagon. "It's a crazy Czech notion, building a house out of lawn clippings." The sentiment rippled through the small gathering of onlookers. Foolish, mad, a waste of a summer's labor that would only end in failure and a foreclosure notice from the land office. Jaromir Kovacic simply turned back to his work. He picked up another 40-pound brick of living earth and placed it on the wall, tamping it into place with his hands. The mockery lasted for the rest of the afternoon. The validation would have to wait for the cruelest freeze in Nebraska memory. What did this Moravian peasant builder, this Selski Stavridel, understand about the living earth, about thermal mass, and the biology of roots, that these seasoned, successful frontiersmen had missed entirely? The answer to that question would not only save his family, but would change the way hundreds of others survived on the unforgiving plains. It's a story of quiet genius and the deep wisdom of tradition, and I promise if you stay with me, you will learn a fundamental principle of physics that this man understood in his bones. So, subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments. What's the most unconventional building material you've ever seen used for a house? Jaromir Kovacic was not a carpenter. He had no formal training as a stonemason or an engineer. In the old country, in the rolling hills near Velerad, he was what they called a selski stavitelj, a peasant builder. He was a farmer who knew how to read the land not from a book, but from the feel of it under his feet. His expertise came from working with the materials at hand: river stone for foundations, bent saplings for wattle, and clay mixed with straw for daub. His hands knew the heft of a wet clod of earth, the friction of woven willow, the resonant thud of a well-set fieldstone. He had helped his father build retaining walls along the Morava River, not with mortar, but with carefully selected blocks of living sod cut from the floodplain and stacked so the roots would re-knit, grabbing hold of each other to form a barrier stronger than any mortared wall against the spring floods. He knew that grass given a chance wanted to live. This knowledge was useless, he thought. When he first arrived in Nebraska with his wife, Agnieszka, and their two small children, Jacob and Zuzana. Here there were no stones, no forests, no deep clay pits. There was only the sky, an endless ocean of grass, and the wind. The wind was a constant presence, a physical force that wore away at resolve and whistled through the flimsy walls of their claim shack. Their first winter, the winter of 1884, was a lesson in humility, a brutal education in the physics of cold. It wasn't a record-breaking winter, merely a typical one, but that was enough. Jaromir had built their initial shelter, as he was told, a simple timber frame affair with board and batten siding, a structure that would have been adequate for a summer shed in Moravia. On the prairie, it was a sieve. The cold found every nail hole, every seam between the planks, every gap in the window frames. Agnieszka's lard pail, left on the covered porch, grew a thick fur of frost overnight, the fat within frozen as hard as a rock. In the mornings, she would try to work at her sewing machine, a prized possession carried all the way from Europe, but the handwheel would not turn. The oil in its delicate mechanisms had congealed to the consistency of wax. Jaromir had to bring it close to the stove for half an hour before she could begin to mend the children's worn coats. Worst of all were the windows. Ice bloomed in the mullions, intricate, crystalline ferns that grew thicker each day. By January, the ice was so thick he could have whittled it into shapes for the children. It was beautiful, in a terrifying way. It was the cold, made visible, creeping into their home. They burned through their woodpile at an alarming rate, the heat from the cast-iron stove radiating a few feet out before being sucked away by the frigid walls. The family lived in a small bubble of warmth, wearing their coats indoors, their breath pluming in the corners of the single room. Agnieszka never complained, her stoicism a quiet rebuke to the howling wind. But Jaromir saw the exhaustion in her eyes and the pale cast of her skin. He saw Jakub and Zuzana, huddled together under a pile of quilts, their sleep troubled. He had brought them to this vast, empty land for a better life, and he was failing to provide the most basic human need: shelter. He vowed he would not face another winter like that. He would not fail them again. The problem, as Jaromir came to understand it, wasn't just the cold. The problem was the conventional solution. All around him, his neighbors were building soddies according to the accepted wisdom of the plains. They plowed thin strips of sod, maybe 2 or 3 inches thick, and flipped them over, stacking them like bricks with the grass side down. They'd fill the gaps with dirt, creating a wall that was, in essence, a stack of dead turf held together with loose soil. These structures were a vast improvement over a wooden shack, but they were deeply flawed. Caleb Finch's house was a perfect example. Finch was a meticulous builder. His walls were thick, his corners square, yet on a cold day you could feel the drafts. The wind didn't blow through the walls, but it infiltrated them. The thousands of linear feet of mortar joints, where one sod brick met another, were thermal bridges. Each one was a tiny highway for the cold to creep in. Furthermore, the sod itself was inert. Once the grass roots died and decomposed, the wall became a simple mass of packed earth. It had thermal mass, yes, it could store heat, but it had no integrity. It was a pile, not a structure. Every spring, Finch and his sons spent a week patching the walls, filling the cracks that had opened as the freeze-thaw cycle worked its will on the thousands of individual blocks. The house was in a constant state of slow, managed decay. It kept the worst of the winter out, but at a high cost in fuel and constant labor. The house was a barrier against nature, and nature always found a way through. Jaromir saw this and remembered the living walls along the Morava River. He remembered how the roots would weave together, turning 100 small blocks into one continuous living mat. The prairie sod, with its 20-foot deep root systems, was far stronger than the riverbank turf of his homeland. The frontiersman saw sod as dirt bricks. Jaromir saw it as a dormant textile, waiting to be woven into a house. He began his work in late July, giving the walls time to settle before winter. The first step was the jig. He built a simple but precise wooden frame, a bottomless box with handles, exactly 4 inches high, 12 inches wide, and 24 inches long. This, along with a sharpened spade, was his only specialized tool. He chose his site carefully, a gentle rise with good drainage, covered in the densest buffalo grass he could find. Then the labor began. It was a process of relentless, back-breaking repetition. He would drive the spade into the prairie, cutting a 2-foot trench, then another cut, 1 foot over. Then he'd use the spade to slice horizontally 4 inches below the surface, a feat of strength and skill that left other homesteaders shaking their heads. He'd pry the massive brick free, lift its 40-pound weight, and carry it to the growing foundation. He did this 2,000 times. The foundation itself was simply the scraped earth, leveled and packed. He laid the first course of his monstrous bricks directly on the ground, grass side facing inward. Then came the second course, laid crosswise to the first, again with the grass facing in. He used no mortar, no mud, no slurry. He relied on the immense weight of the blocks and the precision of their fit. Bartholomew Fenstermacher made his official objection during a visit in early September, when the walls were shoulder high. He brought 2 members of the Homestead board with him, their faces grim. "Mr. Kovacic," Fenstermacher began, tapping a neatly stacked corner with his walking stick, "I have lodged a formal concern. My calculations show that a wall constructed of non-uniform, unmortared blocks of this size will be dangerously susceptible to differential subsidence during the spring thaw. When the frost comes out of the ground, one side of your structure will sink faster than the other. It will twist your roof frame, crack your walls, and render the building unsafe. It will not pass a prove-up inspection. You are jeopardizing your claim." The 2 board members nodded in solemn agreement. This was not just a neighborly critique. It was an economic threat. If his house failed the inspection, he would lose everything. Jaromir looked at the wall, at the green fuzz of grass on the interior. He ran a hand over it. He looked at Fenstermacher, his eyes steady. "The roots will hold it," he said quietly. Fenstermacher scoffed. "Roots? This is a house, not a garden plot. This is your final warning." He turned and left, his companions following in his wake. Anezhka had been watching from the door of their drafty shack. She brought him a dipper of water. Her face was worried. "Jaromir," she said in Czech, "the auditor is an important man. Are you sure?" He took the dipper and drank deeply. He looked at the long, green walls, now catching the late afternoon sun. "In the village," he said, "they say the strongest fence is a living one. This is the same. We are asking the prairie to grow us a house." She trusted him. She didn't understand the principle, but she understood the man. She nodded and went back to their temporary home, leaving him to his work. By October, the walls were complete. A single, 60-foot-long room, 20 feet wide, with walls 3 feet thick at the base. He built a hipped roof frame from cottonwood, a sturdy design that distributed weight evenly, and then laid more sod bricks over the planking, creating a living roof. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of damp earth and crushed grass. With the help of Jakub, he coated the interior walls with a wash of lime and water. The whitewash brightened the space and, more importantly, would reflect the heat from the stove back into the room. The house was finished. It was long, low, and shaggy, looking more like a feature of the landscape than a building. It was ready. And so was the winter. To understand why Jaromir's house worked, you have to understand two fundamental principles of physics that he knew not by name, but by feel. The first is thermal mass. The second, and far more critical, is the biological integrity of a living system. Let's start with mass. The walls of Jaromir's cabin contained 2,000 sod bricks, each weighing approximately 40 pounds. That's 80,000 pounds or 40 tons of dense, tightly packed earth. For comparison, a typical timber frame house of the same size might weigh 10 tons. This immense mass acted as a thermal battery. In physics, this is called heat capacity. A material with high heat capacity, like earth or stone, can absorb and store a tremendous amount of thermal energy. Throughout the day, the small cast iron stove would run, burning cheap fuel like dried cow chips or precious wood. The heat energy, measured in British thermal units or BTUs, didn't just warm the air in the room. It soaked into the 40 tons of whitewashed earth walls. The lime wash helped reflect radiant heat back into the living space, but the sheer conductive potential of the dense sod pulled the warmth deep into the wall's core. By evening, the walls themselves were saturated with heat. When the fire died down to embers overnight, the process reversed. The walls, now warmer than the air in the room, slowly radiated their stored energy back into the space, maintaining a stable temperature for hours. A conventional soddy had some of this effect, but it was compromised. This is where Jaromir's true genius, born from Moravian folk tradition, came into play. Root binding. The problem with the standard sod house wasn't just the drafts at the mortar joints. The problem was that the wall was a dead collection of parts. It was an assembly. Jaromir's wall was an organism. By placing the grass side of the sod bricks facing the warm interior, he did something revolutionary. He gave the roots a reason to live. The rhizomes of the prairie grass, a famously resilient and deep-rooted plant, were not killed by being cut. They were merely dormant. Now, facing the relative warmth and moisture of the indoor environment, they did what they were biologically programmed to do. They grew, slowly, imperceptibly. Through the autumn months, the roots and rhizomes began to push out from each of the 2,000 blocks. They sought warmth, moisture, and connection. They grew across the hair-thin, mortarless seams between the bricks. A root from one brick would find and fuse with a root from its neighbor. They interlocked, wove together, creating a dense, fibrous internal web. The process was akin to 1,000 tiny grafts taking hold. Over the course of a few months, the 2,000 individual bricks ceased to exist as separate units. They were fused into a single, monolithic, continuous mat of earth and root. The wall was no longer an assembly. It was one piece. This eliminated the thousands of tiny gaps that plagued a conventional soddy. There were no avenues for air infiltration. The wind could howl at 30 miles per hour against the outer surface, But inside that living wall, the air was still. The structure had effectively healed itself into a seamless whole. Bartholomew Fenstermacher's fear of differential subsidence was based on a correct understanding of how dead blocks behave. But he was looking at a house and seeing a pile of bricks. Jaromir had built a living thing. The interwoven root structure gave the wall a tensile strength that packed dirt simply doesn't have. It distributed the load of the roof evenly, behaving like a form of natural rebar. The house wouldn't warp because it wasn't a collection of pieces that could shift independently. It was a single entity, as integrated and tough as the prairie from which it was cut. The winter arrived gently at first, with a few cold snaps in November that sent the neighbors scrambling for their woodpiles. Jaromir's family felt the change, but indoors, life remained placid. A small, steady fire kept the long room comfortable. Then, in the second week of January, the true test arrived. The weather turned freakish, a phenomenon the old-timers called a plains thaw and snap. For 4 days, a warm, moist southern wind blew up from the Gulf. The temperature climbed to an unseasonable 38 degrees Fahrenheit. The snowpack melted, soaking the frozen ground, and then froze again each night, glazing the entire prairie in a treacherous sheet of ice. The world looked like it had been dipped in glass. It was eerily beautiful. Then the snap came. The wind swung around to the north, a brutal, straight-line gale that seemed to pour directly from the Arctic. The temperature plummeted. In 12 hours, it dropped 60 degrees. For the next 7 nights, the official reading in the county seat was minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. But it was the wind that made it lethal. A 30-mile-per-hour wind at that temperature produced a wind chill that even the most hardened settlers couldn't calculate. They could only feel it as a physical assault. For the Finch family, it was a battle for survival. Their well-built soddy felt like it was under siege. The wind pushed through the walls, not as a draft, but as a pervasive, seeping cold. They stuffed rags into the window frames and hung quilts over the doors. They fed their stove constantly, the fire roaring, but the heat barely reached the corners of the room. The children slept in a huddle on the floor, as close to the stove as they dared, fully clothed under a mountain of blankets. At Jedediah Miller's farm, the fight was for his livestock. His wooden barn was no match for the wind. He lost 3 calves the first night, frozen solid where they stood. He and his son spent the next days trying to nail extra boards and canvas over the gaps, their hands growing numb and useless in minutes. Inside Jaromir Kovacic's long, shaggy house, a different reality prevailed. The north wind hit the 3-foot-thick earthen wall and stopped. There was no whistle, no draft, no seeping cold. The 40 tons of thermal mass, saturated with heat from the day's small fire, now radiated a gentle, steady warmth. The family moved about the 60-foot room in their shirt sleeves. Agnieszka was at her sewing machine by the window, the handwheel turning as smoothly as it would on a summer afternoon. Jakob and Zuzana played a game with dried corn cobs on the floor, their laughter echoing in the calm, quiet space. The air smelled faintly of earth, lime, and baking bread. The only sound from the outside was a low, distant moan, the sound of a storm that was happening somewhere else. The night before the cold snap began, Agnieszka had heated water for baths. A large galvanized wash tub, half full of the now tepid water, sat against the long interior wall, waiting to be used for scrubbing the floors in the morning. In any other house in Saline County, that tub of water would have been a solid block of ice by dawn. But here, in the house that was alive, it remained simply water. Antonin Svoboda was a good man in a hard job. As an agent for the Czech-American Mutual Aid Society, his work was to check on the welfare of the new immigrant families, especially the widows and the sick. On the 3rd night of the great cold, with the wind still screaming across the glazed prairie, he bundled himself in every layer he owned and set out on foot to call on the widow Hruska, whose farm lay a mile beyond the Kovarek claim. Walking was treacherous on the ice, but necessary. His horse could easily break a leg. As dusk settled, painting the frozen world in shades of violet and gray, Svoboda trudged past the scattered homesteads. Each one was a portrait of the struggle against the cold. Plumes of frantic smoke poured from every chimney, a sign of a stove being pushed to its limit. Around every door and window frame he could see a thick white ring of frost, a telltale sign of heat leakage. Warm, moist air from inside was escaping through the gaps, hitting the Arctic air and freezing instantly. It was the signature of a house losing its life's warmth. Then he saw Jaromir Kovacic's place. It was unmistakable, that long, low shape against the snow, but something was wrong. Or rather, something was profoundly right. There was only a thin, lazy wisp of smoke rising from the chimney, as if from a slow-burning, casual fire. And the door casing was clean. There was no frost ring, none at all. Svoboda paused, his breath freezing in his scarf. It didn't make sense. A house this tight should have been impossible. Curiosity overriding his mission, he crunched across the icy yard to the door. He pulled off his thick mitten. Out of habit, born from a lifetime of winters, he prepared himself for the sharp, searing sting of his bare skin touching frozen wood and iron. He rapped his knuckles on the door. There was no sting. The wood was cool, yes, but it wasn't frozen. It felt like cellar wood, not like a surface exposed to a -30-degree gale. He knocked again, harder this time, just to be sure. His skin came away unmarked. The door opened. A man stood silhouetted against a calm, lamplit interior. It was Kovacic. But what struck Svoboda was not the sight of the man, but the feeling of the air that washed over him. It wasn't the blast of baking, dry heat one felt near an overworked stove. It was a wave of stable, gentle, room-temperature warmth. Behind Kovacic, Svoboda could see his wife sewing and his children playing on the floor. No one was wearing a coat. "Dobry večer," Jaromir said, a calm welcome. "Come in from the cold." Svoboda stepped inside, and it was like entering a different season. The terrible, omnipotent wind was gone. The air was still and quiet. He took off his hat and looked around, dumbfounded. "How?" he asked, his voice full of awe. "Your fire, it is so small." Jaromir gestured to the walls, the clean, whitewashed expanse of them. "The house holds the heat," he said simply. The next morning, Svoboda returned. He had to see it in the daylight to confirm what he'd experienced. He found Jaromir outside, tending to his livestock in a small, attached shed that was also remarkably free of the worst of the cold. Inside the house, Agnieszka was just beginning her morning chores. She went to the galvanized tub of bath water that had sat against the wall all night. She tilted it, and the water poured smoothly into her scrub bucket. It was still liquid. Svoboda stared. In the Hruska widow's cabin, her water bucket had been a solid cylinder of ice that morning, which she'd had to thaw near the fire. Every family he knew had to do the same, often cracking the ice with a stove iron to get it out of the bucket. This simple domestic fact, water that did not freeze overnight indoors during the worst cold snap in memory, was more powerful than any thermometer reading. It was proof. He went directly to Bartholomew Fenstermacher. The county auditor was in his office, bundled in a wool coat, trying to work near his own stove. Svoboda told him what he had seen. Fenstermacher was dismissive. "A fluke, a pocket of calm air. It's impossible." "Go and see," Svoboda urged. "Take your own thermometer. See the water that does not freeze." Driven by a combination of disbelief and civic duty, Fenstermacher did just that. He rode his sleigh out to the Kovacic claim. his own expensive thermometer tucked in his coat. He found the long, strange house looking serene in the brutal wind. He did not knock. He simply stood outside the north-facing wall for 10 minutes, the one taking the full force of the gale. He placed a gloved hand on the sod. He could feel no vibration, no hint of the storm that was raging against it. When Jaromir opened the door to his knock, Fenstermacher was met with the same impossible wave of stable warmth. He stepped inside, his eyes wide. He saw the life within, the comfortable children, the placid wife, the tiny fire. He saw the tub of water. He unbuttoned his coat and produced his thermometer. It read 68 degrees. He did not apologize for his mockery. Men like Fenstermacher did not apologize. But his conversion was absolute. He looked at the thick, seamless walls, then at the quiet man who had built them. He finally understood that he was not looking at a pile of sawed bricks. "You didn't build a wall," Fenstermacher said, his voice stripped of all its official bluster. "You built a lung." The metaphor was imperfect, but it captured the truth he had just witnessed. This house was a living, breathing thing. The story of the house that breathed spread quickly through the Czech community, carried by Antonín Svoboda. He knew that stories were good, but instructions were better. He arranged a meeting between Jaromir and the editor of Hospodář, the Czech-language farming weekly that was the lifeblood of information for homesteaders across the state. Jaromir was a man of few words and was not interested in fame. He couldn't explain the physics in scientific terms, but he could draw. On a piece of butcher paper, he sketched the design for his cutting jig, with precise measurements. He drew the coarse and cross laying pattern, showing how the massive bricks interlocked. He added a small note, translated by the editor, "Lay the grass to the fire." The newspaper didn't run a sensational story. It printed the diagrams. The February 1886 issue of Hospodář featured Jaromir's practical, simple drawings on the back page, next to advertisements for seed corn and plows. It was knowledge, presented without fanfare, for people who needed it. The diagram was a piece of viral information in a pre-digital age. It was cut out, saved, and passed from hand to hand. Within 3 weeks, the newspaper estimated that the diagram had reached 240 farmsteads in Nebraska and Kansas, just in time for them to plan their spring building. That summer, the prairie saw the rise of new houses, long and low, with walls laid inside out. Jaromir Kovacic's folk wisdom anticipated, by nearly a century, core principles of modern sustainable architecture. His 40-ton wall was a masterclass in the use of thermal mass, a concept now central to passive solar design. His understanding of the sod as a living entity, capable of fusing itself into a monolithic whole, presaged the development of modern building techniques like rammed earth construction and insulated concrete forms, which seek to create seamless, airtight building envelopes. Architects and engineers today speak of living walls and green roofs, often using complex irrigation and structural systems to achieve what Jaromir did with a spade and a deep understanding of grass. He created a structure that didn't fight the environment, but collaborated with it. It was airtight, super insulated, and built entirely from locally sourced, non-toxic, and biodegradable materials. It was, in its own humble way, a perfect building. In the end, the story of Jaromir Kovacic isn't just about surviving the cold. It's a story about a different way of seeing the world. His neighbors saw the prairie as an obstacle, a vast, hostile emptiness that had to be conquered, tamed, and kept at bay. They built their houses as fortresses, walls meant to seal out the wildness of the land. Jaromir saw things differently. He did not see an enemy. He saw a partner. He understood that the same resilience that allowed the buffalo grass to survive drought, fire, and the crushing hooves of the bison could be harnessed to create shelter. He didn't stack dead walls to keep the cold out. He asked the prairie to grow him a house. He invited its strength, its tenacity, its living, breathing essence inside. He built a home not on the prairie, but of it. A shelter whose walls healed themselves, and whose strength came from the life running through them. He proved that sometimes the most profound innovation is not a new invention, but a deep and humble listening to the wisdom that is already there, waiting in the earth beneath our feet. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found this exploration of historical engineering and human resilience valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories like it. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What other examples of living architecture have you heard of, past or present? Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Anyone attempting to apply historical building methods today should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all modern building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.